Hello, welcome back to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast. This is where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and share practical tips so that we can all connect better between generations. Today, I'm thrilled that we've got a fabulous guest who is on a mission to make sure that her grandbabies have a decent planet to live on. So she's mentoring geniuses to communicate their much needed ideas. She's also extracting, but apparently I'm not allowed to ask what genius, ideas from unsuspecting non-genius people. Then she is driven to keep understanding why people do what they do. In her day job, she's a behavioural neuroscientist, leadership psychologist, genius mentor and adventure traveller. Oh, and she also runs online programmes, of which I have been on one. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lynda Shaw.
Hello, Alastair. How are you doing?
I'm doing fabulously well. Lovely to see you. And I'm going to start like I start all of these podcasts by asking people about their generation. And you are a baby boomer, so you were born somewhere between 1946 and 1964. We won't go into any more details than that. But what we will say is that there are certain things that are associated with that generation, maybe being a bit traditional, maybe being stoic, maybe being resilient. But forget necessarily them, but what kind of things do you think you do fall into the same idea, thoughts, processes of a baby boomer? And where do you think you're actually a bit different?
Oh, well, my ambition in life is to always be an outlier. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask, Alastair. However, I know that you've done seriously good research and you have got a delicious new book out that everybody's got to read. So I would desperate to read it too. So you mentioned three things there: traditional, stoic and resilient. Well, I reckon 2 out of 3 is not bad. I do. I am stoic. I am resilient, but I'm not very traditional. So, but to be honest with you, I wonder if baby boomers are traditional now, but they weren't in their upbringing. So
I think that's a really good point, because you think about it, baby boomers, I think they were one of the most disruptive generations to have ever lived. When you think what happened during the 60s and the 70s, all of the things that happened while they were growing up. So yes, you're absolutely right. They certainly weren't at the time.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, the birth control pill became widely used, if people wanted to, around the world in 1960. So Martin Luther King, with his exceptionally wonderful speech, "I Have a Dream," happened. There were demonstrations on the streets about anti-nuclear war and anti-Vietnam War. So the baby boomers really, especially in those early teenage years, were idealists. They were at the forefront of all of these massive changes and real changes and important changes. So I'm wondering if we are all, our brain was pruned in those times when we are early teenagers, and the brain is doing that reshuffling that it does and needs to do. I'm wondering if perhaps we've wired our brain accordingly, and we are always like that, except life experiences have buried that. And but underneath, perhaps we still are idealists. Perhaps, I don't know. For me, I am definitely an ideas person, and I'm definitely open-minded and wanting the next shiny new ball. So maybe I am an idealist.
But what about growing up? Did you feel that you were the same as people around you, or were you an outlier then too?
No, I was. I have a friend still who was my best friend at school, and she says to me, "Lynda, you never fitted in." Thanks, Joe. So basically, no, I am a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Perhaps that's an indication of my upbringing too, my personal upbringing. I'm an only child, so I had no siblings. So therefore, there was an awful lot of focus on me as the only child, which one could say I was a spoiled brat, but I actually wasn't, because my folks didn't have very much money at all. But I was very much the centre of their attention. So that would probably have made me a bit of a rebel. Yeah, a bit of a rebel.
Well,
I think, like,
I mean, certainly the way that you're brought up and that environment will have made a huge impact. And I don't know why I'm saying that to you, because you're the neuroscientist. You know only too well how those formative years and the way that you are interacting with those around you, makes a huge difference.
Well, it does, because our brain is hardwired from birth that most things we can't change. We're hardwired, for instance, a bird is hardwired to build a nest. We're hardwired for language, but most of it is softwired, which means we can change it, which means it's malleable, which means it's flexible. So if you think about how the brain is softwired, it's softwired from the bottom up, which is our DNA and our immune system. And we thought that our DNA was once our destiny. We now know it's not because of epigenetics, so we can change those things. Then you've got the top-down wiring, which is all about our thoughts and emotions and beliefs and those sorts of things. And then you've got the influences on the way our brain is softwired from our social environmental upbringing. So if you could then add that in to when we are young teenagers and our brain is pruning and reorganizing itself, then you start to realize how all of these influences really make a difference in the way that we think and behave. And indeed, at those same years, our friends become more important than our parents and our teachers, because we have to belong to our peer group. So therefore, that what is going on in our environment, what is going on with our peer group, is going to influence us enormously. And that wiring will continue as we get older, even though, of course, we're constantly rewiring our brain with neuroplasticity. So, yeah,
do you think it changes, between, the way that, the hardwiring, soft wiring may be similar principles, but do you think there's been a change or an evolution of that, is probably the better word, from when you were growing up and, because I know you've got some young grandchildren and you see them growing up, what differences are there at all between that? Or actually, is it just scientific and that's the way it is and they're just in a different environment, but the process is the same?
No, we have, even the brain does evolve, but it takes a lot of generations to see that evolution. So from when I was growing up to children growing up now, that the brain wouldn't have changed that much in that process. We are still incredibly influenced by our peer group. We are still incredibly influenced by our social environmental upbringing, incredibly influenced by so many things, which is why, of course, we need to consider cultural differences as well, which I know that you consider that in great detail. So there are a lot of things that will influence how we think and how we behave, but it's quite interesting when you consider that perhaps those things that we, or the way our brain is wired as teenagers, we may carry on for a very long time in our adulthood. But as I say, life happens, lots of other things happen. We rewire accordingly. But underneath it, from my observations, people are, like the boomers, are idealists at heart. So...
yeah, and I think you're right in that stays with you. I think it manifests itself differently, and it gets, as you mentioned earlier on, it gets maybe buried a little bit. So the perception, because you're older, you're traditional, where in fact, it's like we look at our parents and our great-grandparents, and you couldn't imagine them as teenagers, as youngsters. Clearly they were different to us, but they were still young people going off courting and, and doing all the stuff that young people do. I want to talk a little bit about that, actually, about the habit forming nature of the brain, because I've heard you talk about this before, about how we grow up and how we develop these habits. And I know that's particularly important in the work that you do now with unconscious bias and so on, that, all of that frames who we are. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. In fact, 46% of my talks and workshops last year were on conscious bias, which is a lot. So people are still very interested in the topic, and quite rightly so. Basically, what happens is the brain is exposed to a cacophony of stimuli at any one time, and it can't possibly process it. So we have something called attention. And attention is very tiny, it's very minute. It can actually be faulty. We can be attending to the wrong things at the wrong time, but nevertheless, we have attention. So what we need to do, the brain has to be efficient. It has to be effective. So what it will, with whatever information it's trying to absorb, it will try and get it into unconscious processing as quickly as possible so that it doesn't need attention. Attention is when we are consciously attending to things. Unconscious processing is everything else. It's habits, and it's also something called heuristics. So heuristics are when we label people in a stereotypical way. When we, for instance, let's take if an animal walked into the room, we haven't really paid attention to it. It's not on our radar. We're not consciously aware of it. But we sort of are, and it's got 4 legs, it's got whiskers, it's got 2 ears. Oh, so it must be a cat. But if you attend to it, you realise it's a dog. Okay, so that is heuristic. We have whatever's happening. We try to put it in little compartments, that information into compartments, so that we label it, so we can then not think about it. Put it into our unconscious processing and not think about it. And we do that with human beings. Sometimes, of course, though, those stereotypical ideas are incorrect and also unkind and unfair. So therefore, we have to be extremely aware of them. The trouble is with heuristics, they will also come with unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is when we decide, that person has just come on the tube and the London Underground at midnight, and they've got a mask on, and they are a young person. They look shifty, and you decide to change carriages because you could be in trouble, and so you have stereotyped that person as being a problem. But in actual fact, they may be a doctor who's just come off a double shift, and they're utterly exhausted. And they've got a mask on still because they've been working around patients who are very, very poorly. So we do that. We have to do that. And partly it's driven also by our need to stay safe. But labelling is helpful, but also unhelpful. So we have to be very mindful of that. But yeah, the brain will put things in our unconscious processing as quickly as possible so that it can be efficient and effective.
There's so many things I want to talk about. We're just not going to have enough time, but I'm going to rattle through a few of the things, especially when it comes to generational bias, because one of the comments you hear all the time is, well, the trouble with the young is they just don't have any attention span anymore. And I know you feel quite strongly about the response that we should give that comment.
Well, if you look back, I think Aristotle is even, it's written that he was moaning about the younger generations of today. I think it goes on forever because the next generation is going to be different to our own generation. So we will see differences and therefore maybe criticise when in actual fact we should be curious. There are issues about that. Do you know, I've completely lost the thread. What was the question?
I love it. It was about attention span.
Attention span, that's the one.
Were you paying attention?
It was about attention. So basically, people, you often hear them say, the younger generation don't have the attention span that we had just a short while ago. But I actually think that idea is based on very flimsy research. It's not absolute definite, and you can see for yourself. If you look at a young person gaming, you will see a very long attention span. So therefore, I think what we've got now is we have a situation where the social media and everything, we're having to switch between different things. People are interrupting us all the time in the workplace. And so there is a switching thing going on. So what we're doing is we're switching our attention from one thing to another. Rapidly, we don't know we're doing it. And the trade-off of that is that we are not as efficient and effective, and it can be extremely costly in industry. But we can certainly decide to spend 20 minutes really concentrating on something, or even longer if we decide to, and also we're engaged enough.
And the truth of it is it's happening to all of us because all of us are just having so much more choice than we ever had before. The difference is we look at youngsters and we see ourselves at that age and what we were like. And we've forgotten that times have changed and that all of these stimuli that you were talking about didn't exist in their numbers as they do now.
Absolutely. And bearing in mind that computers, phones, anything at all like that is the tools of the young. It's the tools for all of us, but of course it's their language. So we are all brought up with what we have to use. And therefore it's wise that we all try to understand that and accommodate, and not just accommodate, learn. Learn from each other about all of the stuff what was really beneficial when we were younger and what's really beneficial to the youngsters now, and actually learn from one another.
You deal a lot with unconscious bias. Could we hone in specifically about generational unconscious bias? You talked about that stereotyping, the labeling, and as I always say, patterns are helpful, but pigeonholes aren't. It's understanding where that balance is. When you work with organizations and you help them to tackle unconscious bias, because I know the one thing that you touched on before, and I know you say that unconscious bias isn't something that necessarily can be fixed because it's within us. So how do we best deal with it so that we are really benefiting from the wide range of generations in the workplace at the moment?
I think, funnily enough, that comes up so often when I give the unconscious bias workshops, is how to communicate with the different generations in the same department. I hear words like, well, which is the best generation? That's a terrible thing to say. There's a best generation. Every generation has its strengths and its weaknesses. If we are talking stereotypically. If we're not, every individual has their strengths and their weaknesses. I hear people say, oh, my goodness me, the young generation, I have a real problem communicating with them because of their sense of entitlement. Well, actually, you just think about what that older person has said. Is that not a sense of entitlement? In that they are expecting other people to accommodate them. So the way to get over it is actually to get to know the individuals. Actually get to ask them, what's it like being a teenager now, or just even if that's too direct and the teenager or the younger person or whatever different generation, if they're thinking, oh, for goodness sake, get real. I don't particularly want to answer those sorts of questions. Then no, don't ask that way. You could actually just say, hey, do you fancy going for a walk and getting a bite to eat, or do you fancy having coffee and getting to know each other a bit better? Just something so that you can actually open the channels and understand each other more. And even if you are a more senior person in that department, or indeed if an older family member or whomever, ask the younger ones for help. Just say, I'm really stuck on this. I'm trying to get it, but I don't. Can you give me a hand? And then they will feel useful. They will feel significant, which is one of the most important things anybody can feel on this planet, whether you're 2 years old or 102 years old. Everyone wants to feel valued and valuable and valid. So therefore, if you actually help people feel significant, these other problems you have will start to melt away.
You mentioned earlier on that we stick to our peer group because that's comfortable for us. And I'd love to know what's happening neurologically at that point, the fact that we do stick to ourselves, because what happens then in organizations is that they become effectively generational silos, which aren't particularly helpful because you don't get that mixing up. How do you deal with that? Well, first of all, what's happening neurologically? And then secondly, how do you deal with it?
There is a natural fear that we might be rejected. There's a natural fear of speaking to people where we think we don't belong. So people will hold back because they think that they're not welcome. There is a worry about being misunderstood. There's a worry about, it's easier to speak to your own peer group because you're speaking much more similar language than you might be to different generations. And let's face it, whatever language you speak is continually evolving. So the younger ones will have a slightly different words to use than we do. And if we try to use them as older people, we sound pathetic. So, there's all of this going on.
We've all been there on that one, haven't we?
So basically, what's going on in the brain is that fear and that fear of misunderstanding, feeling of not being understood. But how to get over it is to communicate, talk to one another. And even if there is somebody who doesn't want to communicate, they want to stay in their silo, in their generational silo. Even if they want to do that, then perhaps the person who's the team leader or something could introduce unconscious bias and actually the value that we have in being curious and wanting to learn from one another and open things up a bit. Help us recognize that everybody comes to the table with different skills and different strengths.
Because sometimes we need help, though, to get out of that comfort zone, the comfort zone of sticking with our own. And that happens across, culturally, it comes across in all sorts of different ways. We stick to our own. So sometimes you do need that person on the outside, almost of stirring the pot a little bit, so, kicking people out and saying, come on, mix with other people, almost a bit like a party planner or something.
Yeah, totally. Just to encourage them to just think about things slightly differently. And let's face it, everything is perception. Our own personal reality is nothing more than perception. It's not right, it's not wrong, it just is. So just you're looking at me now, you're hearing me now, and there'll be others who are listening and hearing to me in all sorts of different ways, but they will all hear and see someone different, based upon their own experiences so far, based upon their own perceptions so far, and everybody's correct. You're all right. So if we understand that, if we actually really, that's one of the biggest lessons I teach is perception. If we really understand perception, we get kind of a bit of slack for people. We are a little bit more understanding, have a bit more empathy, a bit more compassion, because if we can keep it front of mind, that, somebody is going to be seeing things and hearing things differently. They're correct. I'll give you a quick example. My mother-in-law, when she was not much longer for this earth, decided she wanted to have her 3 sons over, my husband included, to discuss her will. So I insisted that all 3 boys were there at the same time. And she said she wanted the wives as well. So we sat there quietly and the boys did their thing. And I heard my mother-in-law explain to the boys exactly what was in the will and why she did it. They all agreed, they all understood. I kid you not, with less than a week, all 3 boys heard something differently. And they're brothers. And it was really important. And she had their full attention. But still, that was their perception based upon their own experiences so far. And they were right. There you go. So if we understand that, so much more will be better.
But okay, that's fine. But to take that particular example, you then go away from that meeting. You now have your perceptions, what happened at that meeting, whether it's the reading of a will or whether it's in a business meeting. How do you then deal with almost like the conflict that's going to result out of people understanding something differently?
You have to,
because they feel they're absolutely right.
Yeah, you have to, first of all, giving the lesson about perception is sensible, so that everybody's armed with the right information. You've got to be very transparent with this stuff. You can't hold on to information. You've got to give it freely. And equally, then you once people understand that they may have heard it slightly differently, then you've got memory coming into it. Memory is very faulty. It changes all of the time. And I won't go into that because that's a very long discussion, but very fascinating. And then you qualify. What is it at that moment when you're having this meeting? You qualify it. So right, what have you heard? What actions are you going to take? What do you think the purpose of me saying that is? You've got to qualify. You've got to constantly make sure that you are really clear and that people have understood and answered and said it back to you in their own words.
Lovely. I love that. And it's that giving time rather than jumping on something, which is what we all tend to do because we're in a terrible rush and we haven't got time to read it. No, you need to take that time. Talking of time, I'd like to finish off, if I may, just by asking, and it's a ridiculous question when you've got so much knowledge, in all the things we've talked about. But if you would have 3 tips that you would say to us as individuals, whether it be to our family, be to our friends, or be it in the workplace, where there's a misunderstanding or a miscommunication between generations, what are some of the tools that you teach your clients to help break down those generational barriers?
Well, perception is always the very first one. That's the foundation of absolutely everything. But curiosity has got to come a close second. Be curious about people, want to understand them, want to learn about them. And if you think, I can't be bothered, I don't want to, make yourself. You'll be absolutely astonished at the outcome. So curiosity, learn about them. And do you know what? I think one of the biggest lessons we have is that where is it written that work or life shouldn't be fun? I've not seen it written anywhere. So why don't we just lighten up and have some fun and enjoy one another regardless of their age and regardless of their background? That's my answer.
I love that. I loved hearing, and I'm not sure whether it was from you, but somebody was saying how there was an MD of a company and a fairly new young Gen Z, and they get caught in the lift. They'd never spoken to each other. The lift stopped. They were stuck. All of a sudden, they had to start talking, and they discovered a whole load of things that they had in common. And all of a sudden, from that moment, they had not only the shared experience of the lift, but also those other things as well. And there's a lot of fun things that actually will connect people of different generations. I'm a big skier, and it's lovely how you get round the table at the end of the day, and we've all got that shared, unique experience of the day that we've had skiing together. So, yeah, have fun. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Have fun. Always be kind. Never be unkind with it. But yeah, have fun.
Brilliant. I you know what? Absolutely fantastic. I'm going to go away, make some more notes actually of this, read the transcript again, because I always learn so much when I ever listen to you. Lynda, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Alastair. I've this great time that you've given me this afternoon, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you. And thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.